Of course, Juneteenth should be recognized as a black holiday belonging to black people, but this is not a day purely of joyful celebration. There are so many things that have happened in the past that have left a scar on a lot of black families, and it continues today in some cases. Good evening. Welcome to another edition of the International Grapevine. This is your host, Wallingford Lee. Tonight, International Grapevine, we're going to talk a little bit about Juneteenth, the importance of it, and what does it mean, even though it's a big holiday lately, and the President Biden signed off on this holiday last year. We want to talk about it a little bit because we know Black history is extremely important. And certain places, they don't want to put it into the education system, especially here in Florida and what have you. But we want to take this opportunity with someone who knows a lot about these things. And we're talking about my special guest, Hank Williams, who happened to be a professor of the Department of English and African American Studies in Lehman College. He's had the pleasure of being on our program many times with great programs that we've done with him. And it give us a great deal of pleasure and, of course, satisfaction to have him on our program tonight to talk about Juneteenth. Hank, welcome to our program.
Thank you. Always appreciate the invite, my good brother.
Same here. Same here. It's good to have you. Hank, one of the reasons we wanted to talk a little bit about Juneteenth, we want to do these type of programs for education for the young Black students coming up who might not know, and some of them who found out about this holiday late. Why is Juneteenth so important to us today?
Juneteenth represents a lot of things, and one of the things that I hope we don't lose sight of, because a lot of the time we're going to end up focusing on the federal holiday and the way that it is officially recognized and presented, which is only one piece of it. But we also have to remember that this is something that is self-generated by African people, originally starting in Texas, that we'll probably get into a little bit later on, but then spreading to much larger parts of the country and finally culminating in an official push to actually get recognition of the holiday. So I think the important thing to remember is in terms of thinking about it through an Africana studies lens, there's always a question of who are we to each other as opposed to, who are we to the outside society, and or how does everybody else see us? And I think, those two facets are totally visible in terms of the question of Juneteenth and what it means now and what it's going to mean.
Interesting that you said that. One of the things that draws my attention is the outside society. What is their reflection about Juneteenth? What do they think? What does that represent to them, and what knowledge do they have about it, and how important it is to them?
Several very good questions. Honestly, a lot of that is hard to gauge, although I actually didn't have time before the show to take a look and see if, say, the Pew Foundation or somebody like that had actually done a survey on it. If they haven't, I'm sure they'll have it done by this time next year. But I don't know that there's a whole lot of much broader understanding. To be very honest, a whole lot of people in the Black community were probably not very aware of Juneteenth, or maybe were aware but just on sort of a surface type level before a couple of years ago, and that's fine too. But part of that also, I would think, represents the aspect of how it was generated, and something that largely came out of community self-determination events. And to give just two very quick quasi-local examples, the city of Yonkers has actually, let me back up on that. a black community organizations in the city of Yonkers, which is a northern suburb of New York City, just north of the Bronx. They've had what is essentially a Juneteenth celebration since about the 1970s, although, they haven't actually formally called it Juneteenth until relatively recently, but it had all of the aspects of the celebration and was held roughly about that time of year. There's been one in Harlem for at least, in terms of how far my memory of it goes back, at least about 20 to 25 years. And, two local politicians we've had, actually a political couple, Charles and Inez Barron, out of Brooklyn, who've held several city and state offices, have had their own celebrations for at least the past 20 years. And these have been public celebrations, but they've kind of used their elected political office to do that and raise awareness about it. But I say all that to bring it back to your initial question of, in terms of how people know about it. It's going to be somewhat scattershot, and that partially reflects, again, how the holiday came about. This is something that essentially, we declared ourselves and we decided to start observing. Nobody had to give us permission to do it. We didn't need it. We just did it. So I think in terms of understanding of it, the unevenness of it partially reflects that. But I'll also say the flip side is that does present an opportunity, because to a certain extent, there isn't necessarily a real good template of, oh, okay, this is what you're supposed to do in terms of Juneteenth. This is what it's supposed to mean. And I think that's sort of where the struggle is going to come in terms of how we actually define the holiday and how we want to see it presented in terms of our community. And a lot of time, the outside community is really going to draw off us. And that's what happened in Yonkers. Their official Juneteenth celebration was simply just promoting the celebration that's been done by those activists in the community since the 1970s. But instead of actually trying to create something themselves from scratch, they just went to the people who've already been doing it. And I think that's one of the opportunities that's going to present itself.
I couldn't agree with you more. I lived in Yonkers for over 19 years, and I can tell you that in Yonkers, they were very on board with it. They took it very serious, and it expanded a lot. Matter of fact, a lot of people from the Bronx, Manhattan, even Brooklyn came into Yonkers on various occasions, because the people in Yonkers took this very, very serious, and they spread the message, and all of them took it very serious. And as you talk about the template, this began to spread a lot. This holiday, some people know the purpose. Some people are aware of it finally. As we talk about it and we get deeper into this thing, do you consider this special holiday that represent freedom to Black Americans?
It does that's a tricky question. It does in terms of the very specific reasons why it held meaning to people in Texas, and radiating beyond that. It was very much to celebrate, the day that news of, well, the day that in maybe a better way to put it is the day that enforcement of freedom from enslavement and also the end of the Civil War actually reached Galveston, Texas, and began to radiate out from there. And I think that's kind of the wider significance of it. But in terms of that, also tying into somewhat of the syncretic meaning gathered nature of the holiday, it also has slightly different meanings, because even though we are now beginning to coalesce around the idea of Juneteenth, you've had several varying holidays around this and around other things. So it's meant it's meant at the basis, yes, freedom from enslavement, but it's also meant slightly different things to different people who celebrate it. For instance, the Pinkster holiday, which I don't really have time to get into and don't really know very well. There are several people in New York who've been pushing that, and that is about the same. That is roughly the same time of year. It's actually a little bit occurs actually a little bit earlier than Juneteenth, and that sort of means slightly different things. So what I'm thinking is the cultural meaning of it, I think, is going to be rooted in that initial idea of freedom from enslavement, but it's going to continue to evolve. And I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing, because part of what gives holidays meaning is, number one, how you actually decide to observe them and deciding to observe them. But number two, making sure that they have continued connection to people's lives. And that's very necessarily going to evolve and change over the years. I think the challenge is to make sure that the core understanding of it and the core values, are still at the center of it.
How important are a core value in something like this?
I would say very. And that's something that I think it's going to be a struggle, and it's going to be a little difficult to control, because just like anything else, when it gets further outside the community, it's going to mean different things, and you also don't have total control over how everybody else is going to try to celebrate it, or simply just acknowledge it, which honestly I think, in terms of the wider community, is probably the better way of looking at Juneteenth. People are going to acknowledge it, not necessarily celebrate it, and that's okay too. But I think where we can control is where we probably should be very intentional and very focused on it. So that'll include things like schools, particularly in places where black parents, black educators, possibly black elected officials have some kind of control over that. Community centers, daycare centers, things like that, where you can positively and actively control the socialization of children, and also the way the wider black community interacts with it. Those are all spaces where I think we can do a whole lot to focus on what do we want the core values to mean to us, and how are we going to articulate those going forward.
I think it would be great if the school system would get a little bit more involved and articulate it more, because of the kids. How do you feel white America feels about it? The reason I ask, in all the years, this year, most of all, I don't know if because Biden signed off on it last year, all the TV stations have given it a great deal of
Mhm.
plug, a great deal of importance, a great deal of message. What do you think their your motive is, or motive on something like this?
Well, as to the initial question you asked of how white America feels about it, I don't know. And I can't really give you a good solid answer to that. And honestly, I'm not sure whether or not anybody else can. And just like the black community is not a monolith, they're not a monolith either. So I think, and I can say for sure, there are elements of them that are very much looking to us in terms of, okay, how do we react to this? How do we connect? What should this mean? There are other elements that are going to be largely ambivalent and just take it as a day off, which, to be honest, I mean, a whole lot of people do that with the 4th of July and Christmas and all the other holidays too. So that is nothing new. And there are going to be elements that, quite honestly, are going to be, very inimical to the holiday for a variety of reasons. And that's part of the dynamic also.
Well, one of the staggering things, I mean, my research shows me that Lincoln freed the slaves in 1863. But this news never got to Texas or Galveston until 1865, which truly, truly amazed me. And my question to you, as we get deeper into this thing, fine, they went into Galveston, that's Texas, and they gave the great news about this, that all the slaves were free. Then we come back to why it took so long, which is one question. And the other one was, how was it received by the slave masters?
Excellent questions. There are kind of logistical and political and very honestly, pragmatic answers to all those. In terms of the Emancipation Proclamation that I think you're referring to, that happened in 1862, but didn't was actually designed to give a little bit of to give sort of a last chance for some of the Confederate states to actually sign on, and I believe the deadline for that was January 1st, 1863, or something like that. But one of the things people have to understand is that the Emancipation Proclamation only declared freedom from enslavement in places that the Union did not control, and very specifically excluded some of the border states where enslavement was still practiced. Most specifically, I believe Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, West Virginia and Delaware. And there and so you have to remember what Lincoln is trying to do, right? He is the nation is at war with itself, right? Civil war that everybody at least knows the broad background of, and it is initially not going very well for the Union Army. So Lincoln has a whole lot of things he's trying to do, and we can't fully get into Lincoln, whose views on enslavement and honestly views on African people, racially evolve over the years. But he's trying to do several things. Initially, of course, he's trying to preserve the Union, no matter what, well, to a certain extent, no matter what the cost. So, if that involves making deals with the southern states, he's going to do it. If that involves taking the issue of enslavement off the table, he's going to do that too. And of course, as we know from history, all of that fails. But what he's trying to do in that moment, very specifically, is degrade the capacity of the Southern Confederate states to fight, and B, degrade the capacity for them to use the resources they have. And one of the big resources they have are enslaved African people. So, Lincoln is very much hoping in that moment that, even though it's actually unenforceable in most of the places, that, that word will get out, and it will do what he wants, which is what starts to happen. People begin essentially self-emancipating. When they hear about this, a lot of them say, Lincoln said we're free. Okay, we out. And begin running away or deserting. When you have Union armies advancing, you have very vast amounts of people leaving plantations and running to Union lines for protection, for the idea of enslavement. Quite a few of them are very much interested, for obvious reasons, in terms of being able to help the Union cause, and so on and so on and so forth. So the 1865, when Lincoln, when the war is finally over, and Lincoln gets assassinated, and word finally gets to Galveston in June, basically represents the time period after the end of the war, that that federal troops are able to actually be sent to Texas. And there's kind of a fascinating backstory about that we don't have time to go into, and honestly other people could tell better than I can. But long story short is that Texas is, number one, geographically it's relatively isolated. Then as now, it is literally a huge piece of territory. And you got to remember, this is a time before interstate highways. There are no airplanes. So, the way you're going to get large amount of troops into a place like Texas is by sea. And at that time, and this is kind of a wonky thing, they actually don't have access to the amount of ships they would need that could actually navigate the harbors to get people there. So, very literally, it takes a while to get people together and get them to Galveston, which and Galveston is simply chosen because it's a very large port city, and they can get into that. But the significance of Texas is that, one, you have quite a few Confederates who end up running to Texas in hopes of either A, trying to hide out, or possibly trying to regroup and do a counterattack or something like that. You also then the border is somewhat porous, so you actually have quite a few of them either running into Mexico or creating plans to go into Mexico, and either use that as a base to reattack the United States, or simply to just set up the Confederacy down there. So after the end of the war, then dealing with that issue in Texas and on the Texas border becomes a priority, and that's why you end up having federal troops sent down there. They've already been sent out through, they're already present in other parts of the South where the fighting has been much more intense, and people have been militarily defeated. But you then have to deal with that situation of Texas, and you also have to deal with the situation of simply providing, very basic security and all that sort of thing to the people, because their local government has been crushed.
Very interesting indeed, extremely interesting. As we continue here navigating and moving forward International Grapevine, we'll be right back as we continue to talking to our special guest, Hank Williams, Professor of the Department of English and African American Studies at Lehman College, who has been kind enough to be on our program, discussing the importance of Juneteenth and the holiday and the things that took place in Galveston, Texas, which was 2 years after the slave was free, when they got the news in Galveston, Texas, that all black people were free. We'll be right back on International Grapevine. And we're back here in International Grapevine with my special guest, Hank Williams, talking about Juneteenth, the importance of it, the things that took place. And now we have a holiday of celebration. And, we talked a little bit about how the current media, newspapers, TV, radio, is bringing up Juneteenth and the importance of it. A lot of us as brothers and sisters knew about it from way back when, and we can talk about the ones in Yonkers, how they make sure that everyone knew what it was all about and the losses that was took place. Even in Galveston, when we talk about all the slaves, we're talking about over 250,000 slaves that was freed and freed late. But as we continue talking in the program here for a viewing audience to understand what we're talking about. We're going to go back to Brother Ang. Ang, there's a question that bothers me. When we talk about did every June 10 order free all slaves, as far as you know, or just some of them were not free? Because I read a part of it, even those that were free, some of them continue to work on farms and stuff like that. Okay, so
Well, the actual order that a lot of people reference was simply just sort of a military directives, right? We talked a little bit about before the break that it's a priority for the U.S. to for the Union to actually send Union troops down to Texas. Number one, to stabilize the territory. Number two, deal with the idea of former Confederates who were there, and three, to actually enforce the law. So as so basically what happens is they essentially become, by they I mean the Union generals who gets sent down there to do it. They essentially become the governing parties in the area of Texas. And what they do at the very beginning of arrival there in June of 1865 is to essentially just put out some directives. And of those, the one that becomes the one that be the one that we see now as the Juneteenth order is part of that. But it's basically just, the interesting thing is that these are basically just communiques, that are put out. So there's no real big, at least as far as historians seem to know or have been able to find, so there's no real big grand proclamation or things like that, or this large grand speech where a whole lot of people are carried out. No, these are simply directives that are put out, and the idea is that A, the troops are going to enforce them, and B, they're going to be spread out. So it begins being spread out in a variety of ways. Number one, through newspapers and media. Number two, particularly in a lot of the inland parts of Texas, it becomes spread by cavalry units and troops themselves. By the way, some of whom are black, because black soldiers have become an integral part of the Union Army. But it essentially does a few things. Number one, it says that enslavement has been abolished. Number two, it also directs people who were formerly enslaved to action, that the relationship with their former masters has changed, and they are now supposed to be working for wages, on the property where they were. And finally, the third thing is that it says idleness and I forget the exact wording of it. Maybe I can find it in time. But idleness will not be tolerated. So in other words, you all are still supposed to work, but the
Work.
relationship has changed, and you're now supposed to work for wages instead of being enslaved, and that's it. So all they're essentially doing is actually, because it's all, you're also talking about a military chain of command. So they're not going to go out of pocket and do anything that's going to do sort of an end run around the federal government, or an end run around what the military hierarchy wants. So all it really is doing is essentially reiterating existing law and existing military policy. But what happens is, the way it's crafted is, there's kind of something in there for everybody. So formerly enslaved people are going to hear enslavement's abolished. So if we're going to work, we're now going, if we're going to work, we now need to get paid. The former slave masters are going to hear that, okay, well, people now need to work for us to pay, and also, idleness and whatever other language they use isn't going to be tolerated. So as a result, a lot of them actually read this to the enslaved people on their plantations, where, in cases where people haven't heard about it otherwise. So, and again, of course, remember, this is a time you have to put your mind back to a time where the forms of media we have, and the speed that things can get out and all that stuff does not exist. So all of these things are being spread literally by telegraph, by people on horseback, by people reading these proclamations, all that sort of thing. And the proclamation itself is very short. You're only talking a couple paragraphs or something like that. So it's very simple and to the point.
I would think, though, even though the slave masters must have had some type of mini uprising when these news break out. Honestly, now you have slaves that used to work for free, and you dominate everything they did. Now you have to pay them. One, you have to give them a certain amount, of respect, I think. And I think the only way that kind of got some type of order might have been by the military who was there carrying out these news, because the
Absolutely.
South is the South, and the South will
Hmm.
never change, as you can tell. So I would think there was some type of uprising, and it brought a lot of problems for the slaves and going forward. And maybe that's why some of them had to come north or run away, because it
Absolutely,
was
and you raise a very good point. And one thing I say all the time in my classes is that if you don't understand the absolute defeat of Reconstruction, then the entire history of the 20th century is going to confuse you. Jim Crow makes absolutely no sense if you don't understand that. The Great Migration makes absolutely no sense at all if you don't understand that. Sharecropping makes no sense if you don't understand that. And this kind of gets into much larger questions in this show, but kind of center of it is that point that you already asked, in terms of how the former slave masters are going to take this, is really kind of central to what's happening in Reconstruction, and how that is being enforced. And the defeat essentially comes by political changes that happen in Washington in terms of the commitment to actually enforcing the
forcing.
changes that need to happen in the South to give Black people full citizenship and some sort of economic and political control. And when that is taken away, that really emboldens the white power structure down there to do all the things that we've heard about in the history books, to the KKK, to the lynchings, to the black codes that severely restrict what people can do, to the limitations on voting, and all those other sorts of things. So Juneteenth is kind of tied into that whole promise of Reconstruction in terms of this being a reset. Historian Lerone Bennett Jr. likes to talk about the road not taken in one of his books, in terms of this being one of many different parts on the timeline of this country where you could have gone in a different direction, and the outcome might have been much different, but you didn't.
It's a tough one. It's a tough. I had a friend. I asked a friend of mine that's a banker. Matter of fact, two of them. One of the questions I asked with this new holiday, Juneteenth, does this recognize America the wrongdoing that they did to the slaves over a period of time? And both of them jumped back to me and says, "Wow, that's a loaded question." I said, "It's a loaded question, but it's a logical question
Mhm.
because there is freedom in certain place. But when I sit down and think about, even with elections coming up, Texas making law that you can be in line, but you can't drink water. You're in line,
Mhm.
but you can't sit. So my question to you, by having a holiday like this in Juneteenth coming in the picture, does America recognize the wrongdoing over a period that they were done in slavery to minorities?
To a certain extent, I would say no. There have been pockets of it. There's been sort of a surface recognition of that. But I think, speaking to some of the larger issues you're talking about, no. We have never really had, say, the type of reckoning that Germany had after World War II, where they are forced to deal with the legacy of the Nazis, and very forced to ask, okay, what type of society are we going to have? Are we really going to have the type of society where that can happen? Or are we really going to say, this was absolutely wrong, and we don't want this to happen. We don't want this to happen again. And we also have an obligation to try and undo some of what has been done, including in the case of Germany, reparations to some of the people who were harmed by that. And that's a conversation that this country has yet to have And it's not clear whether or not that'll happen in my lifetime. But I think that may be one of the ways to look at this holiday in terms of how we're going to shape it, both amongst ourselves and amongst the country as a whole. I think for us, number one, it can be possibly a day of reckoning, and in terms of the country as a whole, I think there are, I go back to that quote I gave you from Lerone Bennett, right? The road not taken, meaning that it's, if you're going to, one way to see it would be as a chance to say, how are we going to go forward, and how are we going to go forward differently, in a way that's actually going to, honor everybody and do things in a way that the country hasn't up till now. And whether or not that can be done is, I think, up to people to determine. And and quite honestly, it will be a site of struggle, because if people want that to happen, they're going to have to make it happen, and they're going to have to do a lot of work for it.
Well, it goes without saying. Like I say, America's a great nation, but one of the biggest heel that it has is discrimination. Even today, democracy is in danger because of all the things that happen, which I don't want to get into right now. And we can see it every day in the newspaper, on in the media. It's a very sensitive thing. If we talk about the reckoning and stuff like that and going forward, we can forget. I don't think there'll ever be reparation here. They will never go for it. And I know Germany did it for the for our Jewish brothers and sisters, what they went through with Hitler, and rightfully so. I mean, Hitler killed over 6 or 7 million people. It's terrible things. Now that we talk about the holidays and stuff like that, the celebration of this, otherwise than having a big party and having a barbecue and stuff like that, does the youngsters today who are students understand the importance of it as their parents pass it down to them, what Galveston meant and how late it took? Do they understand? Has this been given to them? And my next question is it in the education system where the schools will talk about these things?
Not that I'm aware of, but I imagine, particularly with the passing of the federal holiday, and in New York State and New York City, we actually have them observed as, as state and local holidays as well. Our last mayor, Bill De Blasio, one of the things he did going out of office was make a proclamation, affirming Juneteenth as a city holiday, and that was later ratified by the city council. So one of the things that I think that does on the positive side, and I have to say, I'm somewhat ambivalent about the official, quote unquote, official recognition as a holiday. But one of the positive things that it does is it puts it on the radar as something that has importance, and B, something, it gives you space to carve time out to do. So because of that, I think increasingly schools in some areas are going to either affirmatively try to embrace part of it and put this in as part of the curriculum, and in other places, I think, there will be some, there will be a little bit of struggle and a little bit of force to get them to do that. But I think the bigger question always for me is, leads back to what Dr. John Henrik Clarke said, that the great Arturo Schomburg, the Afro-Puerto Rican scholar who New York Public Library branch is now named after, Schomburg told him, what you are calling Black history and Negro history are simply just the missing pages of world history. So to me, that's the way I think we should see this. This is, the Juneteenth is important. The background is important, but this is simply just one part of, a much
Larger.
larger understanding of history and how that affects us today that we should have. So that's really the goal. The goal really should be for for a good grasp of history to be generally known, and this just to be one part of it that you can particularize to this day and fit in. But if you know the other piece of it, then fitting this in is much less of a challenge.
Has Juneteenth been observed in part of the South or all of the South? I know here in New York, Pennsylvania, stuff like that, we hear a lot about it. But since all of these things that were created and all the problems started in the South, how involved is the South? How widespread it is? We know there are certain places in Georgia we have good black politicians who talk about it and emphasize it. How widespread is the holiday and the importance of it in the southern part of the states?
Well, as a here's where I think we get back again to the distinction between the official holiday status and recognition of that, and and the difference between how people have affirmatively celebrated it themselves. And some of your listeners may know the name Opal Lee, OPAL, sort of like the gemstone, the
Hmm.
Texas activist who literally walked to Washington D.C. to help get this legislation started. But she had been referred to as the grandmother of Juneteenth in terms of her efforts of actually getting this widely acknowledged over the years. And you have several other, and as I said earlier, you have several other somewhat related holidays, often going under slightly different names. In terms of the legal recognition of it, you I wouldn't be surprised if you find it to be like Dr. King's holiday, where Public Enemy actually had to release a song about it by the time I get to Arizona, in the early 1990s, because that state very intransigently refused to actually honor the holiday. And I imagine you're going to find that along wide swaths of the country. And a lot of time rather neutral sounding justifications will be given for it. Well, it's going to cost too much money, because then we need to give state and municipal employees another day off, or there are already a lot of holidays on the calendar, or all sorts of other things, quite honestly, a lot of which are quite honestly pretty pretty obviously bogus. But it is what it is. So I think that's also going to be piece the second piece of struggle around it.
No question about it. Well, I'm going to have to leave it right there because of time. I want to take this opportunity on behalf of the family of the Grapevine and to tell you thank you so much for being our special guest, and more important, bringing out all these important highlights about the holiday situation that took place in Galveston, Texas. And more importantly, when we talk a little bit about the curriculum and when we talk about education in terms of how important this is to young Black American and America in general. We don't have words to thank you for being our special guest and for sharing those thoughts with us.
Appreciate the time as always. Thank you very much.
It's good to always have you on. Thanks again. And again, this is Wallingford Lee saying good night for the International Grapevine and saying to you, we hope to see you next week at the same time at the same place, where we continue giving you great programs that are very educational and very important to America. Again, thanks for being here with us tonight.